Hello po, good afternoon po sa ating lahat. In celebration of this year's National Women's Month with the theme, We Make Change Work for Women, Agenda ng Kababaihan tungo sa Kaunlaran, we are having this webinar that will be focusing on gender equality and women's human rights. I am Ana Dominic Cadsawan, your host for today, and today is hashtag Purple Tuesday, and we are wearing purple on all Tuesdays of March to signify our support for women's empowerment and gender equality. Through the years, one of the objectives of the National Women's Month celebration is to inspire and empower women and girls to be agents of change. And change, CHANGE, also means compassionate and harmonized actions and networks for gender equality. Today, there will be a very informative day for all of us. So we are requesting you, our viewers, to please share our live stream to your friends, colleagues, and families so we can be partners for change that is gender responsive. And without further ado, let us start our webinar with a prayer to be led by our gender and development focal person, Ms. Maureen Sumage.
Good afternoon to all our participants, to our viewers who joined us today. Let us bow our heads and feel the presence of our Lord God. Dear Lord God, we praise and glorify your most holy name. We thank you for giving us the opportunity to celebrate the National Women's Month with the theme, We Make Change Work for Women, Agenda ng Kababaihan tungo sa Kaunlaran, despite all the unfortunate events that happened around us, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. We also thank you for allowing us to be instrumental in highlighting the women's participation in battling the pandemic, as well as discussing the efforts of the women fisher folks post-pandemic. Dear Lord God, for our webinar this afternoon, please grant our resource person with the knowledge and compassion to deliver their topic, and us participants, all gender alike with clear minds and open hearts to receive these learnings. May these messages inspire us to aspire for gender equality, which in turn will make this world a better place to live in. We are faithful that you heard our supplications. All of these in the name of our Lord and Savior, Christ Jesus. Amen.
And now po, let us hear a message from our dear director, Doc Vivencio Arma Maril. Good po, good afternoon po, Doc Choi.
Hi, good evening. Ay, good afternoon pala. Ano ba yan? Ba't gabi na pa? Okay, so magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Nakamute po pala ako. So ang tanong ko kanina ay mga ilan ba lahat ang umaattend ngayong araw na to? Ilan tayo lahat? Ngayon po mga 29. O siguro baka mamaya madagdagan pa. Baka ang ibang kababaihan ay natutulog pa o Iba sharing ng isang unit. Akala ko mga tawag dito, nagpapaganda pa, nagre-retouch. Okay, so magandang hapon po ulit sa ating lahat. Meron tayong guest speaker, tama ba? Okay, yes po. Sino yung guest speaker natin? Parang hindi ako na-inform. Ano ba yung topic na i-discuss ngayon? Kasi ngayong Abril, taon-taon po ay dineklara na ng ating pamahalaan na ang buwan ng Abril ay ang buwan ng kababaihan. Kaya naman tayo, nagse-celebrate tayo on women in the workforce. At, sige, ito na ang cheese. Okay. So, sino ba yung ating speaker? Attorney Chrissy Shafinat Rubin po. Chrissy Shafinat, ang hirap i-pronounce. Rubin po. Imported ba tong ating speaker? No? Ruben. Ano yung i-discuss niya ngayon? Women empowerment ba ito? Parang noong nakaraan ay ang tawag na nakaraan? Sexual harassment? Ano po ba ang topic? Advancing the agenda of women fisher folks post-pandemic, fulfilling the promise of SEDAW and MCW. Okay. So, nakakayamang sabihin ay parang hindi kaya alam ang ibig sabihin ng ating ditong nakalagay na ating. Okay, at any rate, so this is gender equality. Pag sinabing gender equality, dapat nakikita natin yung equal opportunities and equal rights. Kung doon nagkakamali sa history ng world history or for that American history, women were not allowed to vote noong unang panahon. Women were only relegated to household works. And it only took a time, baga nagkaroon ng right of suffrage ang mga kababaihan. Hindi ko alam kung anong taon inalaw ang mga babaeng bumoto. Pero noong unang panahon, hindi sila pwedeng bumoto. Sa kultura din ng sa Philippine culture din natin, noong unang panahon ay bibihira ang mga babaeng nakapagtapos ng pag-aaral. Kasi nga, ang laging sinasabi, anak na babae, tama nang matuto lamang magbasa at magsulat. At yun lamang at pwede nang humintay ng tamang edad at mag-aasawa na siya. So karaniwan ng mga gawaing bahay ay trabahong ipinagkatiwala sa mga kababaihan. Meron nga rin kasabihan sa Batangas noong unang panahon, hindi ko lang alam kung meron pa yan ngayon na pag marunong ka na raw magkatay ng manok, gigilitan mo yung manok, at tatanggalin mo ng balahibo, hihiwain mo ng tama at lilinisan mo siya, pwede ka na raw mag-asawa. Yan ang mga birong sinasabi nung unang panahon. Pero hindi ko lang alam kung meron pa rin yung mga sinasabing ganyan. So, kung mapapansin nyo dito naman sa opisina natin ay mas marami ang kababaihan kaysa sa mga lalaki, no? Pero yung mga trabahong panlalaki ng babae ay gumagawa ay babae, parang bibihira lamang. Ang alam ko sa Bureau of Plant Industry, merong sa BPI, dalawa lamang, merong 5 estasyon ang BPI na dalawa sa Luzon, isa sa Visayas, at dalawa sa Luzon, isa sa Visayas, meron din tayo sa Mindanao, no? Dito mapapansin niyo sa mga center chiefs namin sa BPI, 2 ang lalaki, 3 ang babae doon. At yung isang hepeng babae doon, ang kanyang driver babae din. Parang siya lamang yung nakita ko na government official, no? She's a center chief, pero ang driver niya ay babae. Parang pag naghanap tayo ng driver, laging lalaki ang nag-a-apply. Bakit kaya? Pero sa mga bibihira din lamang makikita natin mga tsuper, no? Kung tsuper ay lalaki, pagka babae, ba tsuper din ang tawag? No? Kakaunti. Meron lang tayong mga mga riders, ano? Pero babaeng nagda-drive ng Grab, meron ba? Parang wala. Nung panahon ko, sapagkat ewan ko si attorney, Si attorney palagay ko bata pa. Nung panahon ko, merong nag-iisang sikat na taxi driver noong unang panahon. Lady driver siya. Ang pangalan niya Sampaguita. So bago pa na sumikat yung Sampaguita na rock singer na si Sampaguita, meron na naunang Sampaguita sa kanya. Isa siyang lady driver at yung lady driver na yun, nakita ko na siya ng personal. Natatanda ko pang meron niya laging bulaklak sa ulo niya. Mahaba yung buhok niya, no? Meron siyang bulaklak dito sa kanyang tenga. Tapos naninigarilyo siya. Noong unang panahon, hindi naman usang mga sasakyang mayroong aircon. Nakikita mo yung kamay niya nasa labas ng taxi. May hawak na sigarilyo. Ewan ko lang kung mag-google niyo si Sampaguita. She was the famous lady taxi driver during my time. I was in elementary at that time. So mga ano siguro mga late 60s kasi 1959 ako pinanganak eh. So ng mga late 60s nakita ko na yung driver na yun. Sa ngayon parang walang masyadong ganung babae, no? Natutuwa nga lang tayo pag meron nakikita ang lady drivers na ito yung mga sa mga nagde-deliver ng pagkain na ngayong panahon ng pandemic. So, yun lang. Gusto kong maikwento sa inyo na talagang feeling ko hanggang ngayon ay kakaunti pa rin ang mga babaeng nasa taas. No, katulad sa Philippine history natin, dalawang babae pa lamang ang naging presidente natin. Hindi natin alam kung magiging tatlo, but I don't want to talk about politics. Even in Congress and even in Senate, we have more men than women. So it's about siguro nung pa man talaga ang mga babae ang humihingi na ng pagtaas at pag-angat sa kanilang mga kinalalagyan o ang kanilang antas sa lipunan. Okay, okay naman. At hello po, attorney naman. Okay naman po sir sa amin. Maraming salamat po. So yun lang ho at maraming salamat. So let there be equality and there be no bias on gender in this office. May LGBT nga dito eh. No? Okay, maraming salamat po and let's all enjoy this day.
Opo, thank you po Doc for your message po and kwento. Yung po, very informative na po yung message po na binigay po sa atin ni Doc. So I would like to greet lang po ang ating pong mga viewers. We have Sir Fortunato Melchor Calles Jr. from Cabanatuan City, Nueva Ecija, and Miss Donna De Leon from Santa Rosa, Nueva Ecija. And we have din po Miss Juliet Araos from CDO po. Yun. Keep sharing lang po yung ating pong live stream po. So nakarating na po tayo ng Coronadal City, South Cotabato, and sa Nueva Ecija po. So now po, I would like to introduce po to all of you our resource speaker for this afternoon. Our resource speaker is a human rights advocate and lawyer with the Commission on Human Rights Philippines, the country's national human rights institution, and she heads the Commission Center for Women's Human Rights and Gender Equality. She is a product of Bukidnon State University College of Law, and she completed her MA in Women and Development at the College of Social Work and Development UP Diliman with a thesis on lived experiences of women deportees from Sabah. Granted a Chevening Scholarship to the UK in 2017 to 2018, she also obtained her Master in Law with specialization on Law and Gender at SOAS University of London in 2018. Concurrent to her position in the Commission, she also sits as one of the board members of the Women's Legal and Human Rights Bureau, a feminist legal NGO. She also taught human rights law and gender and the law at the San Sebastian Recoletos Law School in Manila. Let us all welcome Attorney Chrissy Shafina Twyla A. Rubin. Good afternoon po, Attorney. Am I reading your name po right?
Can you hear me? Or okay, so I just removed my headset. So again, apologies for that mahina na signal here in the CHR, but thank you for the invite. So I'm going to give today a lecture focusing on gender equality, but actually it's more focused on women fisher folks. So I know that I'm working with the government agency that particularly works with women fisher folks and actually fisher folks in general. And since the Commission on Human Rights conducted a situation or a study monitoring with women fisher folks, I wanted to share that. But of course, we will also be talking about gender equality and women's human rights since, as mentioned earlier, it is Women's Month. So I'm now going to share my screen. Okay, 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 okay. Okay, so I'm now going to start. Can you see my slides? Okay. So this is the topic that I'm going to talk about today. It's advancing the agenda of women fisher folks post-pandemic and fulfilling the promise of CEDAW, which is the Convention and the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the International Agreement on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So this is going to be my outline today. So we do investigate human rights violation. We promote and advocate for human rights, especially of women and gender and LGBTQI. And we do a lot of policy and advisory work. So that's our role as gender umbod under the Magna Carta of Women. And then this is going to be my outline today. We are going to talk about situation of women in general during the pandemic and for the past 2 years. And then we're going to talk about what are our frameworks, what laws and international agreements are we relying on when we talk about substantive equality, gender equality, and that goes into the provisions, some provisions of CEDAW, its principles called substantive equality as compared with other models of equality. And then SDG number 5, which is actually our goal under Sustainable Development Goals, focusing on gender equality. Then we'll go into the work of CHR with marginalized sector and then a focus on the situation of women fisher folks. I'm just going to check if you're hearing me right. Um, am I heard ba? Okay naman yung audio ko? Okay, so that's good. Just worried I'm not getting heard already. So, yan. Okay, so first, situationer. What's the situation of women during the time of the pandemic? Siguro we've all been through the pandemic and we're still in the process of recovering from the pandemic. But one of the things that we as Gender Umbud highlighted during the pandemic is that there is a disproportionate impact of the crisis on women, girls, and those who are in the marginalized sector. Because prior to the pandemic, many women are already vulnerable. We are already living in a society that's very much unequal, and women are mostly those who are vulnerable and marginalized. But during the pandemic, it has been exacerbated, which means that the issues that women were already facing prior to the pandemic, like violence against women, lack of access to employment, gender pay gap, these have been exacerbated or lumala siya when it comes or when the pandemic came in. And we also monitored and found that during the time of the pandemic, the initial response of the government left the needs of many women and girls behind. So since we are so focused on responding to the pandemic, a lot of the needs of women, like for example, pregnant women during pandemic, women who are nursing, and women who are needing prenatal and postnatal care during the pandemic, these needs were not automatically highlighted, no? And there were also accounts of the government failing to respond directly to gender-based violence because much of the resources were focused in on responding to the pandemic. And so gender not being part of the response left a lot of women's needs behind. And so we highlighted that because we wanted the government not to forget the needs of women, particularly those who are pregnant, those who are lactating, those who are needing pre and postnatal care, those who would need contraceptives, otherwise they will end up with unwanted pregnancy. We wanted to highlight the needs of young mothers. We wanted to highlight the needs of women who are mostly informal sector. No? So that's why we came out with this situation. No? We also found that during the pandemic, the economic impact was much worse on women and LGBTQI person. When I say lahat naman tayo tinamaan ng pandemic, why are women more affected and LGBTQI individuals? So prior to the pandemic, women and LGBTQI individuals are mostly in the informal economy. Sila yung naglalako, nagtitinda, sila yung nasa palengke. They are the ones who are doing a lot of informal work. And when it's time to lay off, and most of them are contractual. So when it's time to lay off because of the lockdown, women were the ones to go first, no? LGBTQI individuals, a lot of them are also in the informal sector, and much of the work that they're relying on when the pandemic hit were also lost. And so, since many of them are in the informal economy and in contractual employment, they lost a lot during the pandemic as compared to others. And even 1 year after the pandemic, we knew that it took a long time before our economy was able to recover. No, lockdown still persisted. We had the longest lockdown, and it has economic impacts. And of course, it's felt by every family, Filipino family, especially those who are already living below the poverty line. So when we interview women, especially those who are marginalized and vulnerable in the rural and urban areas, they were talking about the economic impact of the pandemic. They were talking about worsening hunger and poverty. And this is also verified, no, in the reports and the surveys conducted during 2021, which is actually already our second year into the pandemic. And if you look at as well the impact on women, the study of Oxfam, for example, showed that there is a continuing multiple burden and unpaid care work for women. So this means that during the pandemic, even um, before the pandemic, most of the care work, the work in a household is undertaken by men, by women. And then during the pandemic, some men already shared the care work. So they would share in the laundry, the cooking, the taking care of children. But then the study of Oxfam still revealed that while Filipino men lagged more care work hours due to the pandemic, meaning they already share the work in the household, bulk of the tasks still fall on women. And if you take into consideration that meron ng mga online schooling and most women are also the ones attending to the needs of their children in online schooling, you would really know that this is so true, no? The continuing multiple burden and unpaid care work of many women. And this is also true for women in urban and especially also for women in the rural areas. And women also who are indigenous, no, particularly they mentioned that sila nga hindi sila nakapag-aral, they were unable to finish school, and then they are now expected to tutor their children in their schoolwork in online schooling. So there's really a problem of access as well in the digital age for those who are vulnerable and marginalized. So there are also human rights issues in relation to health and emergencies. We know that because of the crisis, a lot of medical frontliners who are women were affected. They were demanding more pay, more benefits, hazard pay, and they were demanding, proper equipment. And mostly, most of the medical frontliners we know are women. And then during the vaccine rollout, there were also gendered issues on it. And so we also had a campaign saying that we have to also focus on vaccine for women who are victims of gender-based violence and for some reason could not go to the vaccine sites. Or we also said that we have to focus on vaccines for homeless individuals. A lot of them are women. And because they would not have the needed documentary or needed IDs so that they will be vaccinated. So dapat if forgo na muna yung mga needed identification. So these were some of the issues during the pandemic for women. And of course, another issue during the pandemic is the issue of gender-based violence. This is the violence directed against a person because of that person's gender. It could be because she is a woman, that's why she's subjected to violence, or it could be because she's a member of the LGBTQIA community. And we said that during the pandemic, this has not really stopped. No, there were a lot or increase in the number of gender-based violence. But if you look at as well the reporting, pagdating sa PMP, there's very low reporting for gender-based violence, and we say that it's not because it's not happening. We say that the low reporting of gender-based violence in the police is because a lot of women are experiencing barriers in reporting. Many offices are closed, the barangay would refuse to accept reports, or the barangay had other priorities to tend to. That's why GBV response is not a priority. So these are the situation of women during the pandemic. And in order to respond to this, and also in order to advance the rights of women, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized, we turn to international instruments, human rights instruments that the Philippines signed, and the laws that the Philippines passed in relation to women's human rights. And so I will be introducing you to the next section, to our frameworks when we talk about women's human rights and gender equality. And the frameworks particularly could be divided into two. It is the first one would be international framework on women's human rights, and then the domestic framework on women's human rights. So when we talk about international, I am referring here to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. And then when we talk about Magna Carta of domestic framework, we're talking about the Magna Carta of Women. And perhaps for those who are working in the GAD, or Gender and Development Committee in the agency, you're already familiar with both frameworks, because for many times we are asked to contribute to the report of the Philippines to CEDAW, or we are also tasked to create programs that respond to our mandates under the Magna Carta of Women. So just a bit of a history. It was mentioned earlier, no, that previously yung women did not have the right to vote. So I wanted to highlight this, no, to show that previously, prior to women's human rights, women had to fight for all the rights that they are currently enjoying right now. So rights that women are enjoying are not given to them in a silver platter. They had to advocate for it. So previously, in the 1900s, early 1900s, women were not allowed or given the right to vote. So there was a question earlier, kailan na-achieve ng kababaihan yung karapatan para bumoto? In the case of the Philippines, it's 1937. Other parts of the world, it's earlier. But actually, the asterisk here would show that it's also depending on the kind of woman you are. Uh, Yun din yung magdedepende if you're given the right to vote. For example, in Canada here, in 1917, there's an asterisk, and also in the US, there's an asterisk. Actually, this means that only specific kinds of women were allowed to vote in 1917 and 1920. They were mostly white women, and they excluded women who are black or women who are indigenous. Just also the same in the case of Australia. So in other parts of the country, especially in the Middle East, it took a long time for them to recognize that women should be given equal rights as men with respect to electoral participation and representation. So previously, really women were not recognized as citizens. They were not given the right to vote. And there are many stories of exclusion of women. They were not allowed to run marathons. They were not allowed to study, as in the case of Malala. They were not allowed to control their own bodies. They were unable to access the needed reproductive health care, access to pills, access to contraceptives. Many countries still practice marriage of children or girl children, which limits the rights of children to health, limits their right to security or protection from violence. So all this shows that women's rights previously were not as enjoyed as they are right now. No, and of course it's thank you to the system of our treaties, particularly on human rights, that has recognized that all persons should be equal in dignity and rights, and that is in our Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex or other status. So as early as the 1940s, 1948, particularly sa UDHR, and 1967, we already have treaties, signed agreements by the Philippines saying that it will not discriminate on the basis of sex, and then it will promote the right of every person in the country. But then again, it was only in 1980 that we had a very specific treaty that's focusing on women, and that is CEDAW. And the writer of CEDAW is a Filipina. You might know her. She is former Senator Leticia Ramos Shahani. She drafted the CEDAW and then proposed and gave it to the Russian delegation. And jointly, the Philippines and the Russian delegation proposed the adoption of a treaty that would protect all women all over the globe from uh, would protect women from all forms of discrimination. So it was adopted in 1979. It was entered into force in 1981, and the Philippines was the drafter and one of the first signatories. It was considered as the International Bill of Rights of Women, and we rely on it to advance further the rights of women, girls, and especially those who are marginalized and vulnerable. It is the second most ratified treaty or agreement in the whole world. The first is the Child Rights Convention. But however, it is also the most with the most reservation. When I say with the most reservation, it means that there are some countries who would not want some provisions of the CEDAW to be applicable in their jurisdiction, and mostly their reservation would pertain to family and marriage. And these countries are Muslim countries mostly, no, because they do not want to follow what's in CEDAW, but would defer to their religion and their culture. So those are the challenges of CEDAW. So now I'm going to go into the principles of CEDAW, and there are three principles. The first is substantive equality, the second is state obligation, and the third is non-discrimination. So state obligation is easy to understand. Since the Philippines signed the treaty, the Philippines, the government has the obligation to fulfill, no, its promise that it will eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, and that it will promote women's rights, no, especially those who are marginalized and vulnerable. And then the second principle is non-discrimination. I said before that there should be no discrimination on the basis of sex, but there are also other grounds for discrimination. For example, your race, your ethnicity, if you're a member of indigenous community, if you're with disability, if you're educated. So basic principle of CEDAW is that all these rights as stated in the treaty should be enjoyed by all, regardless of your identity, regardless of your sex, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your ethnicity. You should not be discriminated against. And the last principle is substantive equality. And I would like to take time to explain what is substantive equality, because this is at the core of CEDAW. Because CEDAW responds to a specific inequality. It recognizes that in our society, globally, the relationship between men and women is not equal. Particularly, men enjoy more benefits in many fields of life and the enjoyment of rights, economic, social, cultural, political. Mostly, ang nasa advantage are men, and then those are at disadvantage are women. And so, the Women's Convention is actually responding to this inequality that was mentioned previously. No, when I said that structurally, historically, women were excluded from the exercise of specific rights, that's where CEDAW was coming from as well. It is a recognition that we live in a patriarchal society. Most of the benefits and privileges are enjoyed by men in this society, and if you want to have an equal society, you have to do or adopt specific measures that will respond to the needs of women, particularly marginalized women. So ang kind of equality that CEDAW promotes is called substantive equality. So just a question, if you look at the screen right now, can you try to guess what is substantive equality? Is it A, B, or C? I'm going to take a minute and to see if you can get the answer correctly. Okay. Okay. Can somebody guess? Can I see the comments? Okay. Can somebody guess? Do you have, is it A, B, or C? I can't see the comments as much. I'm just going to switch. I'm going to show it to you, and then I'm going to switch just so I'm going to see the responses. So when we say substantive equality, is it A, B, or C? Okay, I just saw one palang na nag-respond. So I wanna see if you are listening or if you can still hear me properly. So, is it A, B, or C? I see some of you, many answered B. I want to see other answers. When you say substantive equality means you are or you do recognize that there is prevailing inequality in society and there's a need to address that inequality. So, let me see. Wala pang ibang answer. Let me see. Okay, still B. Actually, the answer here is, okay, let me see. So actually the answer here is C. It's not B. B is actually what we call formal equality. C is what we call substantive equality. And then A is a protective equality. Anybody who can guess why C is the substantive equality provision? May nakaguess, may nagsagot na ng C. Thank you. How about the reason? Can you think of the reason why it's called substantive equality, letter C? So if you look at the picture in letter C, you can see immediately that there's an arrow coming from down sa baba. So it means that the woman here is actually coming from the ground, which is in a lower position as compared to the figure of the man in the right side. So when we talk about substantive equality, you are recognizing that women were coming from a position of disadvantage, and together, men and women alike would have to work together in order to elevate the status of women so that it's going to be equal with that of men. So it recognizes that ang pinanggagalingan ng mga kababaihan in terms of exercise of rights is mas bababa. A lot of opportunities are not enjoyed by women, and mas malala pa if they are vulnerable and marginalized women. And there's a need to have measures to elevate the status of women, not to be higher than men, but to be equal with men. So that's substantive equality. B is formal equality because it treats everyone alike. Like, even if they have differences, a child is different from an adult person, an adult man, an adult woman. A woman is different from an older woman, and then it treats everyone alike. So formal equality does not recognize differences and vulnerabilities, same measure, same programming for everyone. And the problem with this model of equality is that it will perpetuate inequality further. It will not change the unequal status in society. It will just replicate the inequality and maintain it because you are not doing measures to correct what's wrong. So that's why it's not enough in changing an equal stature, an equal situation in our society. Si A naman, it's not also promoted because it is protective equality. When you say protective equality, in order to seemingly advance the rights of a group, like for example women, it tries to protect women, and in the process ay nalilimit niya yung rights ng women. You can hear this kind of equality or model of equality when you hear, for example, your parents or your mother telling you to don't go out at night, don't wear skimpy clothes, don't go out drinking if you don't want to get raped. So those are protective measures. Instead of saying that the society should promote uh, promote the ending violence against women, what they are doing is policing how women should dress, how women should behave. In one case, another example of protective equality measure is preventing women from going or attending or joining marathons or any extreme sports that would test the limits or physical capabilities of women because they said that it will harm a woman's reproductive function. So in that case, even if you're very much interested in joining the sport, you're prevented from doing it. So that is also not the kind of equality that we want to promote because it limits the opportunities of women instead of advancing the enjoyment of rights. So A is protective, B is formal, which just maintain what is already unequal in society by seemingly doing something but actually doing nothing because the measure is the same. It does not recognize vulnerabilities. Di niya inikilala na mas mahirap yung kalagayan ng babaeng may kapansanan na matanda. Tinitreat niya ang pareho ang babaeng may kapansanan na matanda with a person na walang kapansanan, lalaki, mayaman. So that kind of view is unable to respond, no, to inequality. So the best is the substantive equality because it recognizes particular inequalities present in society and then provides measures, no, that will elevate the status of the women or a particular group of women so that they will be able to enjoy same rights as that enjoyed by men. So if we look at another picture that will depict this, formal equality is this: you just give them all the same boxes. So if you look at how formal equality works, it does not help the short person in seeing the game or enjoying the kind of right that he should be enjoying together with other men here, because it's just the same intervention for all of them and it does not recognize the vulnerability and the disadvantage. In the case of equity, which is also the same as substantive equality, you are providing more boxes, and usually this takes the form of affirmative action or temporary special measures in order to recognize the disadvantage and provide a program, an intervention so that the person can enjoy the right that he was meant to enjoy. So in this case, putting two more boxes. And they are called temporary or affirmative actions because pag mawala na yung mga barriers, then there's no need for the boxes anymore. So in this case, sa justice, wala nang kailangan ng boxes. Wala na because everyone is able to enjoy or access and watch the game without the barriers in place. So the goal is really justice, gender justice. But in this case, nandito pa tayo sa substantive equality, no? We have to address both structural, no, and not just be satisfied with providing affirmative actions. So, and then there's also another principle that we have to remember when we talk about SIDO and we talk about the rights of women. Our identity is not just on the basis of sex or gender. It's not we are discriminated or we experience vulnerability and privilege not just on the basis of our sex or our gender, but also because of our other identities, because of our religion, our age, our disability, our geography, our culture, our income. So, for example, you are all government employees and staff. Your position is very much different from the communities that you work with, who are, for example, unable to finish until grade 6, or who are living in a place that is geographically isolated, or if you have members of your community who are also old and with disability, if you compare their status in terms of vulnerability and privilege, it is so much different from your own position. And that is the principle of intersection, that is intersectionality. We recognize that the multiple identities of a person could result, no, in a person's vulnerability or enjoyment of privilege. Okay. So, what is also another important provision of SIDO, and my particularly favorite provision of SIDO, is its Article 5. So, aside from laying out all the rights that should be enjoyed by women, from the right to vote, education, equality in marriage, right to health, there is a particular article in SIDO that requires the state, when I say the state, the government, to address harmful social and cultural practices. So this is a very particular provision because it just you don't usually see this provision in treaties, no, that requires the state to modify cultures and attitudes that are harmful. So here it's actually targeting social and cultural patterns that are harmful to women, and they should be modified, no. And because if they are not modified, then it becomes impossible for us to enjoy the rights that we are enjoying today. So here it's actually targeting social and cultural patterns that are harmful to women, and they should be modified, no. And because if they are not modified, then it becomes impossible for us to enjoy the rights that we are enjoying today. So after discussing the international framework. I'm just curious, again, just another break, just to see and check in with people in the chat box. What kinds of laws on women are you familiar with? Can you chat in the comment part? What laws you're familiar with? What laws on women? Let me see. So somebody earlier, okay, somebody answered VAUC. What else? What laws of women are you familiar with since it's Women's Month? And then we also had new laws on women that were passed this year. This month, there's one that was passed by and signed by the president this month. And then last year, there was also another law passed, particularly affecting young women. So Magna Carta of Women, that's our next topic. What else? Just to check. Okay. Okay, so you're right, no? So those are just two of the laws on women that we have. And actually, here are the list, no, of the laws on women that we have in our country. Okay, so we have many, and many of them are, we have these laws because we are a signatory of CEDAW. And many of these laws are particularly addressing gender-based violence against women. We have sexual harassment laws. We have laws called the Safe Spaces Act, wherein catcalling is already prohibited and penalized. Catcalling, wolf whistling, pambabastos, paninitsit, persistent telling of sexist jokes, those are already prohibited under Safe Streets and Public Spaces Act. And in fact, this law has already been adopted by the Civil Service Commission. And I hope that your agency will also, as led by the Gender and Development Committee, will also take time to review your own Committee on Decorum and Investigation Policy so that it is now going to be compliant with the Safe Spaces Act. And I hope that the other webinar that you'll be scheduling will be a webinar on Safe Spaces Act, because all government agencies are required to discuss the Safe Spaces Act in their agencies, and or even private companies are required to conduct trainings on Safe Spaces Act as part of the mandates or directives of the law. So last year, we also passed our prohibition of child marriage, and we also passed the law raising the age of sexual consent. So before this month, the age of sexual consent is 12. So statutory rape is below 12. Right now, statutory rape is already below 16 years of age. So in that case, all you have to do is to prove the age of the woman and then that there was sexual intercourse, and that's already considered rape, no? Because our age of consent has been raised to 16. And so there's also a need to really have a good campaign, no, to prove the age of the woman that we have. We also passed the law raising the age of sexual consent for men and women, which is of course gender equality law. So if you look at the Magna Carta provisions of the law and different chapters of the law, you would see that it has a declaration of equality policy, which explains why it was passed. Basically, it follows the mandate of the Constitution affirming the role of women in the nation state. And the rights of women are human rights and should be promoted by the state. So it also has a chapter laying out state obligation. That is the government saying that it is our mandate, it is our duty to refrain from discriminating women, to protect women from violence, and to promote and fulfill women's rights. And I think what's important in the Magna Carta of Women that is also in particular importance to your agency is that it has a specific chapter for women in the marginalized sector. And this particular chapter on women in the marginalized sector provide for the rights that should be enjoyed by rural women, including women farmers, women fisher folks. So it has a specific chapter on that. And why is that chapter present? Because the MCW recognizes that these groups of women are particularly vulnerable and marginalized, and they should be given particular attention. So the Magna Carta of Women also has a chapter on institutional mechanisms. So for those serving in the GAD committee, this is where you get your 5% GAD budget, where it directs that every year, every agency should be doing its GAD planning and budgeting. And then after you do your GAD planning and budgeting, you have to submit your GAD accomplishment report with the COA and with PCW. And it also requires all agency to have a gender focal point system, and also requires the agency to have sex disaggregated data. I think BIFAR has a good sex disaggregation of data when it comes to farmers and also fisher folks, and that's also good to maintain, because that's one of the requirement of the Magna Carta of Women. Because if you are unable to count women and make them visible, how are you going to be able to create programs that respond to their needs? So institutional mechanism provisions here particularly respond to the mandate of gender mainstreaming. So that's Magna Carta, and these are its provisions. I mentioned that it has chapters on rights of women. There's a book on protection from violence. Then there are women empowerment provisions, which include the right to health. And then there's a chapter on marginalized women. For mechanisms, I already mentioned GAD planning and budgeting, GAD database. It means that agencies should have sex disaggregated data based on their specific mandates. You should have your gender focal point system in the central office and in all regional offices. If you're an LGU, you should have planning, and then the adoption of focal point system in embassies. So these are the provisions of Magna Carta of Women. Two particular articles on protection of violence, participation and representation, even in the civil service. It has a specific provision on that, and it has also provisions on health, media, etc. Maybe we'll just go through some of the provisions of marginalized sector later. So here you could see that it has particularly protection of girl children, protection of senior citizens, protection of women who are in especially difficult circumstances, protection of indigenous women and Moro women. So these are the provisions of Magna Carta. Protection from violence. So it reiterated na dapat may vow desk in all barangay and monitors the need to have this vow desk in place and functional. During disaster, there's also a recognition that there's a need to protect women in times of crisis. So that's a specific provision, and many agencies are tasked to do that. In terms of health, the Magna Carta of Women accords a 60-day additional leaves, no, if you have undergone gynecological operations. So it depends on what kind of operations that you had. Then you will be given gynecological leave for women based on the Magna Carta of Women. So there's already a CSA resolution on that, and it enumerates what kind of the number of days that you're entitled to, depending on the kind of operation you've had. And if you're working in the private sector, there's also a guideline issued by the DOLE. Another provision of Magna Carta of Women pertains to participation and representation in government, in development bodies, in planning bodies, in political parties. And this is important because even if we say that there are already women senators, women leaders, we have a woman candidate for president, if you look at the numbers, men still hold most of the positions of government. Very few women are in position. And if women are in position right now, it's because mostly they belong to a political dynasty, and they are taking the place of either their father, their husband, their brother, etc., not on their own account. So pagdating sa marginalized women in the marginalized sector, these are a few of the rights that are recognized. And if you look at protection for fisher folks and women in the rural women, you would particularly find provisions pertaining to them in section 20 of the IRR, which is pertaining to food security and productive resources. So if you want to leave no one behind, pursuant to our sustainable development goals, then we have to fulfill the promise of both SIDO, which is dapat walang discrimination against women, and also the Magna Carta of Women, which provides for the rights of women internationally, domestically, and particularly provides for the rights of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, including the communities, women that you work with, women fisher folks, and women farmers. So there is a reminder under SDGs on our targets with respect to elimination of discrimination against women and girls. So actually, our goal number 5 is on gender equality. No? And in order to achieve or eliminate discrimination against women and girls, um, there are already items or targets identified what we should be doing. So this include in order to eliminate discrimination of women and girls, we should also end all violence against women. We eliminate forced marriage and genital mutilation. We should value unpaid care work and promote shared domestic responsibilities, trabahong bahay. Madalas kasi if you're a woman, then you are stereotyped to be the one to be doing the caring for the children, the cooking, the washing, etc. And the studies have shown that this results in the multiple burden of women. Women can no longer enjoy other rights like the right to rest, the right to education, the right to economic participation because they are relegated with care work and domestic work. So according to our SDGs, if we want gender equality as one of our goals, then we should value unpaid care work, bigyang halaga yung trabaho na ginagawa ng mga kababaihan inside the household, and that domestic responsibilities like caring for the children, cooking, laundry, cleaning, this should be shared responsibility between men and women. Otherwise, we will not have gender equality. Then there's also the target that we need to ensure full participation of women in leadership and decision making. We should ensure access to reproductive health. We should have equal participation and equal access to economic resources. That includes access to land, access of rights to fisheries, to farms, to the different development projects that are available by the government, no. And then we should also promote women's empowerment through the use of technology and strengthen policies in relation to gender equality. So those are the things that we should be doing. And if you are working with the Gender and Development Committee of your agency, these are also the targets that you would like to look at. And when you analyze what kind of programs you're going to develop for your agency, the employees and staff of your agency, and for your clients who are women fisher folks and farmers, these are also guideposts because according to our sustainable development goals, if you want to achieve gender equality, we have to address these targets. And if we are unable to address these targets, we cannot achieve gender equality. So yun. So how about the CHR? What do we do as part of our work as gender umbud? I mentioned before that we have BS for the more vulnerable and marginalized. So much of our work actually deals with having dialogues, having spaces of conversations with the most vulnerable and marginalized, and we bring the voices of the women that we talk to government agencies like your agency. We surface their needs, we surface their issues, we surface gaps, and then we present these gaps to the agencies concerned. So, in the hope that the agencies, as duty bearer, as part of the state, will be able to respond to these needs of women. So, for example, in 2016, we have reproductive health inquiries focusing on women with disabilities and women in general. Through that, we were able to identify what are the gaps, no? How women lack access to information, how women are unable to access services, how women with disabilities are prevented from planning their own birth and having their own families by their own families, how they are discriminated when they go to hospitals, how they are unable to access sign language interpreters. So it is through talking with the marginalized groups of women that we are able to hear their stories, we are able to document them, and then we are able to echo them, amplify them, and share their stories to the government agencies meant to hear them. So this today, the reason why I presented that in talking about gender equality and women's human rights, I focus on our situation or on women fisher folks is because I'm talking to you, an agency that works with these communities, and we hope that through the presentation of our situationer, you as actors in your own agency will be able to respond to these issues and gaps. So other works that we had or situationers pertain to other issues like the impact of the war on drugs on women and children, gender and informality, rights of LGBTQI children, women in EPZs. We even have a campaign focusing on the elections because we recognize that it's important to surface the agenda of women, especially those who are marginalized this coming elections. So we had educational sessions with them. We invited COMELEC. We invited an expert on gender to share about the situation of the Philippines during pandemic. We discussed standards, CEDAW, and other laws pertaining women's right to vote. We discussed what are the different positions at stake on May, what are the duties of these positions that we'll be electing, and the importance of choosing correctly our leaders for 2022. And lastly, we also asked different sectors of women what are their agenda, what they would want the future leaders to listen to and to prioritize. So here you would see what are the agenda for indigenous women and women in rural women. So this includes recognizing their ancestral domain, ending violence and criminalization of advocates, social justice, um, recognition of their cultural identity, and then passing laws that are pro-indigenous peoples. No, for rural women, they prioritize health, livelihood, and then freedom from violence. So those are our results um, for our kampanyang Lila. I also gone as also a sort of a break before we go to the situation of women fisher folks. I'm going to share with you our Lila campaign video, which highlights. Um, ayaw siya mag-play. Maybe I can just share it later on. Okay, okay. I'll just share it later on. So now, I'll just check in with you. Are you still okay? Give me a thumbs up or hello if you're okay and you can still hear me. Can I see your comments? Are you still there? Hello. Maybe if you have questions from the first part of our discussion, then you can also already flag or raise some of these questions, particularly those I mentioned on Magna Carta of Women and CEDAW, and then the situation of women during pandemic. If you have any questions on that. Okay, I can see your responses. Thank you. That's good that you're still there. It's affirming for us as speakers, no? Especially yes, yes. Thank you. I wanted to play the Lila video so that you would also have time to stand up and take a break, but I don't think it's playing that well. Let's see again. Okay, let's check. Can you hear the sound? Ano? Can you hear the sound? Can you hear the sound of the video? Were you able to hear the sound of the video? Is that okay? Yes. Okay, I'll continue playing it. Mula noon, mula noon hanggang ngayon, ang sama-samang pagkilos ng mga kababaihan ay mitya ng tunay na pagbabago sa lipunan. Kaya sa darating na eleksyon, linda kulay ng boto para sa may malasakit, makatao, komprehensibo, at maagap na pagtugon sa pandemya. Para sa kalusugan ng iba't ibang grupo ng kababaihan at ng kani-kanilang pamilya na sensitibo at may pagkukuha ang kalinawan. Para sa maunlad at mapayapang kalungsuran
kanayunan at katutubong pamayanan. Kasama na dito ang pagkakaroon ng kapanatagan sa loob at labas ng tahanan. Para sa pantay at walang diskriminasyon na pagtamasa ng mga programa, proyekto, at serbisyo ng gobyerno na hindi hadlangang kasarian, paniniwalang politikal, estado sa lipunan at iba pang identidad. Para sa pamahalaang may respeto, puprotekta at magsusulong ng karapatang pantao, lalong-lalo na ng mga kababaihang nasa laylayan ng lipunan. Para sa maliwanag na kinabukasan, para sa mga may kapansanan, kabataan, LGBT, migrante, nakatatanda, may hirap, mga katutubo, at mga nasa kanayunan. Para sa makatao at makatarungang lipunan, kung saan may pagkilala at pagpapahalaga sa tinig at kakanyahan ng mga kababaihan. Sa darating na eleksyon, ang botong makakababaihan ang mag-aangat sa ating buhay at bayan.
Okay, thank you. So that's our Lila campaign, and it actually shows how we engage with the women in the marginalized sector in order to highlight their voices and their agenda for the upcoming 2022 election. So now this is the last part of my presentation, and I'm going to share with you some of the results of our FGDs or focus group discussion with women fisher folks in 2020. No? So we call it Kababaihang Pangisda sa panahon ng pandemya, and these are conducted by our regional offices, and siguro some of you have been invited by our regional offices to sit in the focus group discussions we've had with our regional offices, and we are very thankful for the participation of the BIFAR participants and officials during our focus group discussion. So why did we undertake the sectoral monitoring focusing on women fisher folks? Because we know that during the time of the pandemic, there's a need to highlight the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable, particularly women. And we know that women fisher folks are among the most vulnerable, no, and even the most poorest among the vulnerable sectors. So we go with the definition of who are women fisher folks, and in doing that, we use the definition of the Magna Carta of Women. So it's not, there's always a tendency na hindi naman ako fisher folk because I don't go out directly to sea and I don't fish. I just gather seashells, etc. I sell the produce, etc. So we had to remind women when we are in FGDs with them that this is the definition of women fisher folks under the Magna Carta of Women. It is defined as those who are directly or indirectly engaged in taking, culturing or processing fishery or aquatic resources. No? So it's a wide definition and could cover many women who are working as fisher folks, not just those who are direct fishing, no, together with their husbands. So as a situationer, we conducted a desk review, and we've learned from this desk review that fisher folks are among the poorest among basic sectors, and women fisher folks are even more poorer, no, because there's already inequality. So mas mababa pa, mas mahirap pa sila, especially if they don't have families to help them. There's also this no that mostly women fisher folks, because they are often not seen as fisher folks, they are invisible, di sila nakikita, therefore they are not valued, they are not counted, they are underrepresented in government bodies or organizations talking about issues of fisher folks. So when we talk about fisher folks, just like when we talk about farmers, we often have the image of men in our heads, no, but in reality we have many women fisher folks and women farmers, except that they are either invisible, undervalued, underrepresented, or not recognized, or their contribution is trivialized. When you say trivialized, parang ay maliit lang naman yung ginagawa niya, taga-tinda lang naman siya, paano siya naging fisher folk? But we already know that from the definition of a fisher folk, it's very wide, no? Directly or indirectly engaged in taking, culturing or processing fishery or aquatic resources. And so they should be able to enjoy the rights accorded to fisher folks. So there's invisibility, di sila nakikita, undervaluing of their contribution, and mostly the undervaluing of their contribution is rooted on the persistence of gender division of labor, or sex and gender division of labor. What do you mean by this? This is also the oldest stereotype, no? And we have, when we say that pag farmer, pag fisher folk, lalaki yan. Pag babae, ikaw yung nag-aalaga ng bata, nagbabantay ng bahay. You are doing household work, household chores. So you're not really seen as much as a fisher folk or as a farmer as compared to your male counterpart. And so the kind of work that women do, including yung pag-prepare ng baon ng husbands nila, yung pag-aayos ng net and fishing equipment, which are part of what women fisher folks are doing according to our interviews with them, these are given little value. And because they are not earning while they're doing it, so it's also because their work is not valued and trivialized, they are not also given the kind of recognition that they need as fisher folks, no? So other issues are disenfranchisement in terms of benefits, especially if they're not listed as fisher folks in their community or under the government agency. So they are unable as well to access social protection. They cannot participate in policy making and consultations. Sometimes when there are consultations, it's the men who would be consulted, and seldom only that women are consulted. In some areas, they said that it's the women who attend the consultations for fisher folks. But when it comes to already distribution of money and benefits, then it's the men who would attend. So there's also that, no, pag day-to-day na operations, then it's the women who would attend. But if it's already economic, with money involved, the men would be attending. So that's also persistent indication of stereotypes, no, and the differing access to resources. So other issues include migration, hindi na nag-fisher folk or nagfa-farmer because there are better opportunities in urban areas. And of course, there are various forms of gender-based violence. So here are the issues of many women fisher folks, underrepresented in implementation of programs, underpaid and undervalued the kind of work they do. In terms of data, very very much not counted, no? So konti na nga yung fisher folks na bilang, mas konti pa yung bilang ng women as fisher folks, and mostly because they themselves do not recognize or do not know that they are actually covered by the definition of fisher folks under the law. And as a government agency working with women fisher folks and fisher folks in general, it is also part of how we're going to increase this number in data and how we can render visible the communities that we work with. Kasi yung sa lumabas sa data nila is that hindi nila alam na fisher folks sila, or they are unable to access it because they said that nandun na yung husband niya, bakit kailangan pa sila? So they're also underrepresented in policies. And of course, their gender needs are not given due attention, except that there are also some FGDs that showed there are many gender responsive, no, na mga programa na nailunsad or na-adapt na yung before. So why did we do the study? Because we wanted to have a baseline on the roles, participation of women in small-scale fishing. What are their issues? Do they face issues of trafficking and GBV? Do they know about the Magna Carta of Women, particularly provisions of Magna Carta of Women on GB on fisher folks? And we wanted to know the impact of the pandemic on them, no? So we involved 15 of our regional offices, and they conducted FGDs, as I said, with government, including before, if possible and available, and also with community women. They would go to women, fisher folks, in order to interview them and have these questions with them. So First, they would identify sa community sila pupunta, then they conduct KII, then they will provide transportation and relief packs as allowances, and then they also have FGDs with duty bearers, government agencies. Then they present the results, no. Again, probably kayo yung iba ay nakapag-participate na sa process na ito in 2020 because this was undertaken by our regional offices. If you look at the tool or the questionnaire we use, these are the questions that were asked. Ano yung roles nila as women fisher folks? Are they able to participate? Are they recognized? Do they have access to information and resources and food production? Do they experience stigma and discrimination? Have they experienced gender-based violence? Ano yung impact ng pandemic sa kanila and what are their recommendations? So these are the areas that we were able to consult. Yan. And we have an article released about it already. If you want to read it, the article access is here. But the full report itself is still pending approval by our commissioners. No, so it discussed some of the few findings of our study on the situation of women fisher folks. It's titled "Rendering Visibility" because it provides a space to talk about the lived experiences of women fisher folks in the Philippines, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the results would show that they are still feeling they are invisible in terms of programming, in terms of policy, and in terms of data. And there are still a lot to be done in order to respond to the needs of women fisher folks. So what frameworks did we use? We used the framework of CEDO, which I discussed earlier. It has a specific article on rural women, and an interpretation of this article is found in General Recommendation 34. There's also a link here. Basically, the expert of CEDO are telling the states that they should be able to respond to the situation of fisher folks, and also they should know that fisher folks and rural women in general are not homogeneous, hindi magkakapareho. They have intersecting identities that could render them more vulnerable. Again, Sido mentioned that the fisher folk could be old, the fisher folk could be with disability, the fisher folk could be living in an area where they are unable to access resources. So government should be able to address that kind of gap and need. And also, particularly, I highlight this part of the general comment or general recommendation of SIDO because it directs the state parties, which is the Philippines, to establish institutional, legal, and policy framework that will ensure rural development and other water policies that they should be gender responsive and adequately budgeted. So that means that SIDO is directing the Philippines through its ministries, through its different agencies, to ensure that policies and programs are gender responsive and are adequately budgeted. So this means integration and mainstreaming of gender in all agricultural and rural development policies, strategies, and plans, no, and also includes, of course, participation of rural women, including women fisher folks. So to see or to check the enumeration, no, of the rights of women fisher folks under Magna Carta of Women, you just have to go to section 20 and you would see there that the Magna Carta of Women said that women fisher folks should be able to enjoy the same kind of rights that men are enjoying. Equal access to the enjoyment of land, water, and other natural resource, equal access to use and management of fisheries and aquatic resources, and they should have equal access to benefits in accruing to stakeholders in the fishing industry. And during our consultation, there are a lot of issues here because if they are not seen, again, if they are invisible, and not seen as members or stakeholders in fishing industry, then they are not targeted by government programming. So if you're an agency or a region that sees this particular invisibility and need of women fisher folks, then you would create programs that will reach out to women fisher folks, that will strengthen organizations of women and would support them so that they'll be stronger and they'll be able to participate in government programs. So I will not enumerate all of this already, no, because it's already there. Na siya equal status in the issuance of stewardship and agreements and other fishery rights, women organization to be accorded equal treatment in stewardship. There shall be no discrimination in deputization of fish wardens. So all these are pertaining to fisheries. Then we had our FGDs, and we found out, for example, in this slide, these are the findings of our Region 3 FGDs. So they were able to find that there's limited support services for reproductive work of women fisher folks. So dumadami pa rin yung reproductive burden nila. Wala silang kaalaman and access to information on laws and rights of women fisher folks. Many of them do not even recognize they are fisher folks. They lack representation in fisheries association. Mostly men sit in these organizations, and that very few of our regions were able to document existence of women's organization. No adequate attention and recognition to women fisher folks. So those are some of the areas. So these are just some of the lines that we're able to gather from our FGDs. So in terms of roles, participation, and access to resources, marami sa responses um, show that they do not even know that they are women fisher folks. So in Region 1, 53 of the women we interviewed do not categorize or consider themselves as members of fisher folks or as fisher folks, but they are actually fisher folks. In some instances, they recognize that it's only their husband or their child is in the list in BIFAR. Themselves, they are not part of BIFAR. Okay, the 80% in Aringay of women who were interviewed were not members in the list of BIFAR or DA. And it's important for us because most of those who we were able to interview also showed that if you're in the list of DA or BIFAR, then you will be able to access information, programs, benefits, social protection that the government is according to the sector. Okay. And then here we will also show, for example, in Pampanga, all of the respondents agree that since they are not member organizations, they have not been given recognition and has not received support. So yung iba, wala din silang knowledge. So for those who are members of organization, mas marami silang alam na programa at may marami silang natatanggap na benepisyo. During the pandemic, of course, affected yung kanilang income, affected yung the way that they are able to go out to fish. And even if they are able to fish, some of them, many of them are unable to sell their fish because of the lockdowns that were in place. So there's financial difficulties. They could not purchase the kind of medicine and support that they needed because they cannot sell their product to the market. And this particular interviewee in Talisay, Cebu even said that even his customers or her customers were unable to purchase many fish from them, no, because they were also facing financial issues. So, yun, no. Many were quarantined, kahit isang tuka. So, even if they were able to spend time with their family, they also noticed that a lot of burden also, no, dahil maraming trabaho and they have to take on the work when it comes to online learning. Pero some of them also recognize that their husbands and children are already sharing some of the work, no, in the household. Here, this is a statement from a fisher folk in Cebu. Lumabas sila ng 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. to fish but were unable to bring home anything. No fish, no viand, no income. So hunger is often mentioned. In terms of gender violence, there were accounts of gender-based violence in the hands of their husbands. Some were also able to share that ito, grabe, binuhusan siya ng mainit na sabaw ng husband niya, no, dahil wala siya nakuhang huli nung siya ay nangisda. So, that's also an account, no. And then they were also observing na may mga akyat barko or trafficking or prostitution in their areas. And so this also highlights the need to address gender-based violence when we work with women fisher folks. Okay. So our recommendation is, and I hope it will be considered, would be to ensure the effective implementation of Magna Carta of Women, particularly the provisions for fisher folks, to ensure and create programs that will allow women fisher folks access to information, access to resources, access to training and livelihood. And then very important to establish and strengthen support for women fisher folks organization, because we have seen that many women who are not members of organizations, they do not see themselves as fisher folks. They are unable to articulate their rights and the benefits that they should be able to accord by virtue of being fisher folks, because don't have access to training and access to an organization that will be able to support them. So if we can create programs to support organizations, that would be very good. Then we also also recommend enhancing training of barangay vow desk officers so that in fisher communities especially, so that they can respond to cases of gender-based violence in their communities, and also to address issues of trafficking. And then also to enhance capacities of women fisher folks and organizations in rights training, including response again to GBV. So in general, if you look at it, it's not just the protection of women fisher folks in our SIDO and Magna Carta. What is important is that for women fisher folks should be able to enjoy de facto enjoyment of rights. When you say de facto, hindi lang nasa batas yung enjoyment of rights, but they are actually able to enjoy the promises of the law in their everyday lives. So in order to do this, we have to recognize and render visible women fisher folks in all fishing communities, engage with them, that they are able to participate meaningfully. May boses sila, hindi lang sila taga-timpla ng kape, hindi lang sila sekretarya, hindi lang sila asawa ng mga husbands nila, but they are also active members of organization, able to articulate needs, plans, be part of the planning, and be part of the programming. Recognize them as distinct from that of their men in the database and programming, strengthen further sex and sector segregated data, support organizations, and then support women fisher folks in terms of financial and livelihood assistance. It's good that we already have or you already respond to gendered needs and issues of women fisher folks. But we could do further, no? We could take into consideration their care work. We can provide support when we conduct training with them. We already also think about child care. Sino mag-aalaga ng mga anak nila pag magkakaroon tayo ng pa-training sa kanila, because many women are unable to attend trainings because they have to also take care of their children, they have to cook, etc. So we have to take this into consideration if we really want them to participate. Also, the need for accessible tools, access to low interest tools, access to gender sensitive fishing equipment. Many fisher folks, women fisher folks mentioned this, no, and they appreciate the programs of BIFAR wherein these were introduced effectively. So, okay, enhanced mechanism for social protection and protection from violence, as mentioned earlier. So, how do we do this, no? For COVID-19 response and recovery, more access to information, especially in risk prevention, ano yung programa available by the government, ano yung medical services and information that they need in cases of GBV. So, in our report, we recommend enhancing is we issued a joint memorandum circular and we titled it Ensuring Gender Responsive Intervention to COVID-19 and the New Normal. And in our JMC, we said that when you respond to the pandemic or a crisis, you have to recognize the specific context and vulnerabilities of marginalized groups. Because if we're going to treat everyone alike, without specific interventions for those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, then you are not really responding to their felt needs during that time of crisis. So that's all, and I hope that my lecture is able to guide you as you traveled with me from our discussion on the situation of women during pandemic to our sharing of our situation, particularly on women fisher folks. So that's all, and thank you very much.
Yes po. Thank you po, Attorney, for a very informative discussion po on SIDO, Magna Carta of Women, and what you do po on the Commission on Human Rights and the situation of women and fisher folks po. Sa ating mga viewers po, if you have questions about the discussion po, you can now type your questions po on the comment box below, and it will be answered po by our speaker. And while they are typing their questions po, ako po muna yung magtatanong po kay attorney. And um, attorney, every time po we talk about gender equality, people often think po that the benefits will only be for women for girls po, and now we have men po that are watching. Is gender equality a concern po for men, or may mga dapat po ba sila ikabahala po?
When we talk about gender equality, of course, men are involved, no? It requires a recognition that currently we are living in a society that privileges men more compared to women. But it also involves men because men will have a big role to play in order to address the current inequality in society. And that's why earlier I started with a slide showing how previously in history women were not able to enjoy a lot of rights, just to contextualize, because I'm always asked when I discuss women's human rights or gender equality, why are we talking only about women? Why are we not talking about men? Why are we having laws on women but not laws on men? Because basically, if you look at history, culturally, politically, all positions, all privileges are enjoyed by men. So nandun na sila sa taas. So what we are doing is to address the disadvantage, and to also work so that women will be able to enjoy the same rights that men are already enjoying. And for that to work, we have to engage with men, because if they do not see this as unfair, the current situation, then they will just replicate that kind of treatment of women. So that's why we also have a campaign called He for She, wherein women themselves and men themselves are advocating for gender equality, and men opposed to violence against women everywhere, wherein men themselves will say that it's wrong to subject women to violence, and that is a violation of rights. And we are also talking about masculinities being the harm done to men when we talk about toxic masculinity. Ano ba yung tunay na lalaki? What kind of attitude should I be displaying para matawag na tunay na lalaki? And we highlight that actually expectations like that, norms like that also harm men, no? In the process. And that's why we have to change them. This sort of expectation of how a man or woman should be behaving in society. So we do that through lectures like this. We do that through gender sensitivity trainings. We do that through creating programs and policies that support mainstreaming of gender in our work. So yun.
So, thank you po, attorney po, for the answer po. And for our viewers po, if you have questions po, just key in lang po sa ating comment box po. We'll be reading po your questions. And in relation po dun sa answer po ni attorney, so dapat po pala ang mga babae at lalaki po ay maging partners po um, in achieving po this ano po na gender equality. And in relation po to that, meron po kami nakuha po na question po dito po sa amin po sa BAFS na sa panahon daw po ngayon, kailangan pa po ba maging gentleman towards women since equal po ang men and women? Yun po yung question niya, attorney.
Ano yun? Can you repeat? That was cut off a little bit.
Kaya, sa panahon daw po ngayon, kailangan pa po ba maging gentleman towards women since equal po ang men and women po when it comes to gender ano po, equality po.
I would go back to our protectionist approaches. So what do you mean when you say gentlemen against women? So i-unpack natin yung pagiging gentleman na sinasabi, no? So baka kasi yung pagiging gentleman ay sabihin na turuan sila babae na di dapat gender equality is not giving up a seat in the MRT. It's not just about that, no. It's actually access to more resources, access to economic empowerment. So, hindi naman na sinasabi wag ka na maging gentleman, but you interrogate yourself, saan nanggagaling yung action mo? Is it because you recognize that men are equal and that therefore you do not accord special privileges? Or is it because gusto mo ipakita na you're the strong person, so gusto mo siyang gawin para protectionist ka? It's not going to be good for women when we have protection system that is not effective. So
Po, meron lang po ata tayong problem po with
okay,
connection po.
eto na
Ayan na po.
tayo. Okay,
Na po.
sorry. So, I'm just going to go back to that question. Bakit mayroon tayong couch for women at wala tayong general yung couch for men? So, it's one of our affirmative action, no? I said that may nire-recognize na in some cases sa transport, women are subjected to different forms of gender-based violence, no? Nahihipuan, na harass. That's why we have a specific um, coach for women. So, that's a situation. Pagdating naman dun sa kung pauupuin mo ba yung babae, it depends to you, no? Kasi nga naman din, for example, matandang babae, di kaya naman talaga na nakatayo. So, of course, you would apply your lens of intersectionality. Mas vulnerable siya. Mas kailangan niya yung seat na yun. So, i-give up mo yun, no? Pero equally naman, kung pareho kayong malakas na babae, pareho kayong malakas na lalaki, you don't need to give up that seat, no? So, it depends also in the situation and the kind of your reasoning when you say yung pagpapaka-gentleman. I just hope that it won't be the kind of pagpapaka-gentleman na maging protective ka, like wag kang magsuot ng maiksing palda, wag kang lumabas ng bahay, because those are also harmful, no? When we have protectionist approaches, instead of promoting gender equality, nalilimit mo yung rights na nai-enjoy ng isang babae. And lastly, when we talk about pagpapaka-gentleman, siguro sa tatanungin natin, will this be promoting rights of all, dignity of all? Yun yung ating tatanungin.
So, thank you po. Sa ating po bang mga viewers, meron pa po ba tayong mga questions? Yan po. Mukhang ito po, attorney, halimbawa raw po yung mga scenario po sa MRT, like yung hindi po binigay yung seat pero yun na po yung na-discuss po nyo kanina po. So, meron pa po ba tayong mga questions po? If wala na po, we want to thank you po, attorney, for answering po all our questions, for giving us a very informative discussion, and especially po for giving us time this afternoon despite your busy schedules po. We know that marami po kayong nare-receive na invites, and you're here with us po, sharing your knowledge and expertise. We thank you po for that, and to express po our gratitude and appreciation, we'll be awarding you po a certificate of appreciation po. Republic of the Philippines, Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Agriculture and Fisheries Standards, award this certificate of appreciation to Attorney Chrissy Shafina Tuale Rubin for imparting her knowledge, valuable insights, and assistance to the Bureau of Agriculture and Fisheries Standards during the We Make Change Work for Women agenda ng kababaihan tungo sa kaunlaran, via Facebook Live, this 22nd day of March 2020, signed by our director po, Dr. Vivencio R. Mamari. Yun po, thank you so much po, attorney, for your time po. And we hope po that this will not be the last time po na mapagbigyan niyo po kami. Yes po.
Thank you. It's our
Thank you po.
pleasure.
Opo, stay safe po. Ingat po tayong lahat. And for our viewers po, to get a certificate from this webinar, kindly fill out the evaluation form po that will be flashed on the screen, and will be pinned po on the comment section below. And you have until tomorrow po, tomorrow afternoon to fill out po the form. And for those po na humabol po ng panonood sa ating webinar and may nakaligtaan po tayong topic na gusto po nating balikan, you can rewatch this webinar po since this is recorded, may replay po ito sa aming Facebook page po. And for more updates regarding the Philippine National Standards, our activities po here sa BAFS, and for more webinars, kindly like and follow our Facebook page to get the latest update. And this has been Ano Dominic Kadsawan, and let us bring the country closer to narrowing the gender gaps and move towards sustainable and equitable development. Thank you and see you next time. Bye-bye.